Hello and welcome to the Spotlight Vancouver podcast. I am your host, Doug Varenas, licensed realtor in Oregon and Washington. And today we are talking about accessory dwelling units or ADUs. We're going to talk about what they are, a little bit of the general regulations of rural and urban ADUs, and who an ADU might be right for. And stick around to the end, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Washington Bond Program and how it's helping first-time homebuyers with down payment assistance. But first, we're going to get into ADUs, accessory dwelling units. Now, I get a lot of questions about ADUs because people are beginning to see the utility that they provide. Now, an accessory dwelling unit is sort of like an independent apartment or living area that can be within a home, or it can be detached and adjacent to the home. And it usually includes its own bathroom, bedroom, and kitchen. So it's basically sort of like a mother-in-law apartment, mother-in-law suite. And there's a couple of people that I think this is going to be really useful for. And part of that audience is going to be in that name, mother-in-law, or if you're looking for a multi-generational living situation where you have elderly parents that are going to be living with you because they can no longer live without sort of having some extra help or an eye on them, that can be a great solution for people. And I don't think we've begun to see that quite as much. You're seeing a little bit more. And what I'm seeing is older parents actually who are looking to live with their grown children in a multi-generational setting, and they're looking to pool their resources. So you're having usually the elderly parents that have a little more money, and they are buying a property, and they don't want to live necessarily in the same house, or they want to have their own separate living area while they're living with their children. And I think this is a great situation for people because there's a lot of synergy there with the parents who might at some point need some extra help living independently, but they don't want to go to like a facility. And also for the children who may have trouble affording a home and also could benefit from having grandparents nearby, if and when they decide to have children. So I find that that's what I'm seeing out there with ADUs, is that it's for multi-generational living, and it's really convenient for that. Another set of people who might benefit from an ADU are parents that have adult children or soon-to-be adult children who have a disability, who may need some extra help but want to live quasi-independently, and the parents want to keep them kind of nearby. Again, this can be pretty cost-effective instead of having a day program or some facility where they're living in where they're not going to be as independent or they're going to be further away. I think it's a great way to keep those adult kids who may need some extra care close to you and give them the opportunity to have a little more independence in their living situation. But those are the two main. I forgot one. Whoops. The other one are investors. Let's not forget about the investors out there. I almost forgot. And this applies to myself because recently I looked into having an ADU built on a rental property that we own in Carter Park neighborhood, Vancouver. So a pretty dense neighborhood, very walkable neighborhood. And, my thesis on real estate investing has changed a little bit, especially in this area where the ADU regulations are a little bit more lax and you're able to take advantage of them, is that instead of acquiring more rental properties, more real estate, to actually build upon current rentals to maximize their potential. And so the estimate that I got for the ADU, the new construction, it was a conversion of a current garage. So a conversion is a good way to skirt some of the ADU rules because you get kind of grandfathered in if you leave a certain percentage of the old structure up and you build on it. And I believe it's a very small portion that needs to remain, like it can be a wall. And so with that, we were looking to have a garage and a 2-bedroom, 2-bath ADU built, and it involved cutting down a tree, and it's a little bit complicated, but it ended up, the estimate was a little bit over $200,000, which is no small amount of change. But if you're an investor, you're looking at rent for something like that in that neighborhood to be around $2,000 or a little bit less. And so you're really reaching that 1% rule. So the 1% rule says that, if you can get rent that's 1% of the purchase price, you're doing very well. And that's exceedingly rare. I mean, it's pretty much impossible in this area. You still find the 1% rule doable in, the Midwest and the South. But a lot of times that involves buying in an area that's not very good, or the condition of the house isn't that great. So it's a cost-effective way if you can finance it and put as little money as possible into the deal to make it cash flow, or at least be, cash flow neutral. So you're not having to pay anything else into it. The renters are going to pay off the entire debt service of that ADU. I think that is a great way for investors to move forward on properties that they already own and kind of squeeze the juice out of that property. And I definitely looked into it. I haven't pulled the trigger yet. It is pretty expensive. That's, over $200 a square foot easily. And so things just aren't cheap. And so the construction of an ADU is going to be in that, we're talking about a stick-built ADU, is going to be, in that 152 area, depending on the square footage. I find if you want something livable with enough square footage to be fairly comfortable, it's going to be in that range. I think you could do it a little bit cheaper if you were really looking to just like convert a garage into a living space. I mean, you could do that, for a lot less, but then, do people want to live in a 500, or less, 500 square foot or less garage? I'm not sure. But so investors, multi-generation, and people with adult children with disabilities, I see really benefiting from the ADU legislation in Vancouver, Washington. And so there are urban ADUs and rural ADUs, and they're a little bit different. So an urban ADU, you're going to need permitting for all of this, and you're going to need to comply with zoning. But if you have a residential home in an urban setting, or what's deemed an urban setting, you can have an ADU as long as it is 1,000 square feet or under. It needs to be 10 feet from the primary residence. And that's why when I have people looking for properties and they're interested in ADUs, I will direct them to look for properties where the primary home is positioned either towards the back of the lot or the front of the lot, or someplace, usually the back or the front, where you're going to be able to put an ADU without any problems. Now, the garage that I had was like 3 feet from the property line. And with an ADU, if you're going to build it from scratch, it needs to be 5 feet from the property line, unless you're doing a conversion for a garage conversion. And then you can kind of skirt that by being grandfathered in, which is great. And so if you can convert a structure that's already there, like a garage, I think that's going to be your best bet, because I think the permitting is easier. And again, you're going to have some leniency with the setbacks that are required for the AD. So, but you can also do it as a basement apartment. So in that same house, ironically, I also have kind of a separate entrance, kind of like a Jack and Jill entrance. So I do have a separate entrance into the basement. So if I did want to put in an egress window, because that's going to be required to make it a bedroom, and I wanted to plumb in a bathroom and a kitchen, I could also make that an ADU. And so that is another option for inside of a home. And that would be great for like a family member. I'm not sure if I want to have, just a renter coming up and down the stairs, but maybe it's up to your comfort level. But the garage conversion or the basement apartment is a pretty common ADU condition or qualification. All ADUs have to comply with zoning, and they have to be connected to the city water and the sewer. Or in the case of a rural ADU, they need to be connected to your septic. And so that's a requirement. In a rural ADU, it can be more than 1,000 square feet. It could be 1,500 square feet or 40% of the original dwelling, up to 40% of the area of the primary dwelling's living area, whichever is less. And I will have these regulations in the show notes, so you can go and check them out for yourself as well. So I mentioned that the setback needs to be 10 feet from primary, 5 feet from the property line. The ADU square footage cannot exceed the square footage of the primary dwelling. So you cannot build, something and call it an ADU, or have an ADU that exceeds the square footage of a property. Building height is going to be 25 feet high in an urban setting, and you are able to have an ADU without required to have on-site parking. If you have no on-street parking, you may be required to have an extra spot for somebody, but if there is on-street parking, you do not have to provide a dedicated parking spot. So that's really good. Structural guidelines for ADUs, they need to be in compliance with the architectural and building material structure of the current primary living area. So, you can't have something that doesn't fit in stylistically or doesn't use kind of similar building materials. And again, these will be posted so you can check them out yourself. It says you cannot establish an accessory dwelling unit if there are 2 or more single family residences on a property. I haven't really encountered that too much. Usually you'll have one primary dwelling unit and then like a single family home, and then you will have the ADU adjacent to that or as part of it. And let's see a little bit of some extra stuff for parking for rural ADUs. It says you are required to have an on-site parking for a rural ADU, which makes sense because you'll be out in the country and there's not a lot of streets, so you have to have some place for somebody to park if you have an ADU. There are impact fees associated with having an ADU, but Clark County is providing incentives to waive 75% of these fees for people who apply for ADU permits. The permitting, not cheap. I got estimates $2 to $4 grand. Plans will also run you that much. Now, there are some people that have their own in-house planners and construction. And so there's a lot of companies out there that specialize in ADUs, especially in Clark County. I'll have links to those too. And so you have a lot of options when it comes to ADUs, and I really see them taking off here. I think I've said that. I've thought that for a couple of years now, and I've seen in certain neighborhoods, especially high density, very walkable neighborhoods, I've seen more ADUs. So, Lincoln, Carter Park, Howe, Rose Village, and then, you see them less in northern suburban areas. But and that's a lot of times as a product of, having smaller or having, sometimes it's smaller lots or the way the home's positioned, it's hard to put in an ADU. So positioning of the primary home is very important. So I'm trying to think if I have anything else that I want to cover for ADUs, and I think that's it. I don't want to overspeak or simply just go over all of the requirements. I think that generally covers them. Again, I'll have those linked in the show notes. Before I go, I did want to mention some information about the Washington Bond Program. It is a program for first-time homebuyers, and the definition of first-time homebuyers can be pretty liberal. I recently had a client who had been divorced, and so she had bought a home with her ex-husband, but now that she was a single mother, she was eligible again and you receive on average about 10 grand for down payment assistance. So you need to have a minimum credit score of 620 for the Washington Bond Program and a debt to income ratio that does not exceed 50%. And so the Washington Bond Program is good for VA, FHA, and conventional loans. You have to go through a course, I believe. So there's like kind of a class that you have to take to kind of educate yourself and to fulfill a requirement to be eligible for the Washington Bond Program. So it's a good way to get some help for a down payment. If you're wondering if your down payment's big enough or you're struggling to come up with a down payment, this can really help. So it covers first-time homeowners, as I mentioned, single parents, displaced homemakers, and again, people who have owned a home with a spouse but are now looking to buy a home on their own. So I think that's going to about do it for this week's episode. I hope I brought some value in explaining kind of what an ADU is, who it might be for, and some of the general outlines for the requirements by the county to build an ADU. And I thank you for watching and subscribing. If you've found any value at this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It does help the channel. And I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.